Shalom, I'm Dr. Deanna Dye with Foundations in Torah and Bible Interact TV. Welcome to this series on Hezekiah. I call it Hezekiah in the Shadow of Messiah. And Hezekiah actually turns out to be a most beloved figure in Scripture, although few people know much about him. So hopefully after we go through this series, you'll know more about him than you could ever imagine. He is a very interesting character, and much of his life really is a reflection of what was accomplished in the life of Yeshua the Messiah. So I'm going to show you as we go through all the various connections between the two, and hopefully you'll be transformed by your understanding of Hezekiah. Now, his name actually means strength of God. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But there is a phrase called the Goel Chazak, which means the strong redeemer. So really Hezekiah's life reflects this idea of redemption, and certainly we know with Yeshua, he was our redeemer. He came to bring redemption to the world. And the sages anciently viewed Hezekiah as literally being the Messiah to come. And so because of that connection of what the sages said, I decided to really look at his life in more detail to try to understand why they made that connection. And I really came to the conclusion that Hezekiah's life mirrors the life of Yeshua the Messiah. One of the main things that Hezekiah accomplished was that of the restoration of the temple and its services after his father Ahaz had totally destroyed it. And so the idea of Hezekiah rebuilding, restoring the physical temple, we can see ahead to Yeshua, who would restore and rebuild the spiritual temple, if you will. Now, one of the main features in the life of Hezekiah was the attack by Sennacherib. Sanherib is Hebrew name, from Nineveh. And we have fixed dates on that particular attack, and that attack really has much to do with prophecy as well. Really, prophecy is just history repeated. So if we can go back and understand the history and the players at that time, then we'll be able to understand something about prophecy or what will come ahead, because really in the course of human history, everything is just repeated. It's just repeated patterns. We find also that Hezekiah experienced an illness, and you'll recall that he was given an additional 15 years. And that particular event happens close to the time of the attack by Sennacherib. And reading in Ezekiel 38 and 39, it talks about Gog and Magog, and really those have been connected with Sennacherib. And we'll see that as we go along. I'm just going to kind of throw out to you some of the elements that we're going to look at. Again, it's a very prophetic life, that of Hezekiah, and even in the very details of his name and when he came to the throne, how old he was, how long he ruled, etc. Also associated with Hezekiah, again, we mentioned the redemption, but the idea of the virgin birth. That's very key in all of this. And of course, he's being called Emmanuel. It also talks about what he does with the bronze serpent, the one that was lifted up in the wilderness under the time of Moshe. And his particular period, although you'll see as we go through, there's a lot of controversy over the dating. But we're just going to look at it from the perspective of a particular book I have read by Edward Teal, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. And from that, it appears that the time that Hezekiah ruled on the throne specifically, where there was no co-regency, was 715 to about 686, somewhere in there. And it appears that the time that Hezekiah ruled in Judah, he was the king of Judah, was after the fall of Samaria. And this is another very key point in history, and we have a relatively fixed date for that as well. And that fall of Samaria led to the dispersion of the northern tribes. So you can see there's a lot of history that takes place in the life of Hezekiah, and I think it's very important that we begin to understand it if we're going to understand the time in which we live. So it's rather significant. Now, of course, one of the things that people are quite familiar with is Hezekiah's tunnel. And for those of you who've been to Jerusalem, hopefully you've had a chance to go through the tunnel. It's kind of an interesting experience. It's great when it's summer and hot outside, and you go through the tunnel there and walk through the water. But so much of the archaeology around Jerusalem and to the city of David has to do with Hezekiah again. So his life reflects what we have today archaeologically, certainly historical events, and the focus for some of this, again, is the city of David. The pool of Shiloah, or the pool of Siloam, is another important place connected to Hezekiah, also the Gihon spring. So this whole historical, archaeological background, again, points us to the direction of prophecy. And certainly the war with Gog and Magog, which is the war with Sennacherib, who was from Nineveh, the Assyrians. The tunnel was built for that purpose, was to basically protect the water supply for the city of Jerusalem from the enemy, the Assyrians. Also inside the old city today, you can find the broad wall that Hezekiah constructed also to protect the city. So there are a lot of fragments and archaeological items that are left in Jerusalem, around the city of David, that show us Hezekiah was there, even more so than really any other king. So it's kind of interesting. Now, the major places we can find the story of Hezekiah is in 2 Kings, chapters 18 through 20. And really, all through Isaiah, the first half of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, and then again in 2 Chronicles 29 through 32. Now, there's certainly some crossover. There's information that's in both places, but then in some of these areas, there's brand new information that you don't find, say, between Chronicles and the Kings. So there really is quite a bit about the life of Hezekiah, and he's one of these figures that we know very little about. And all of this information really gives us a much clearer picture of who he was and what he accomplished and how he truly was a picture of the Messiah to come. Now, the main prophet for the time of Hezekiah is Isaiah, Yeshayahu, and he actually prophesied for a period of 52 years through 4 of the kings of Judah, from Uzziahu or Uzziah, Yotam, you might know him as Jotham, Ahaz, who is kind of a key figure in this, and that's Hezekiah's father, and then Hezekiah or Hezekiah himself. And really much of Isaiah is really dealing with Hezekiah, but again, all of those kings were that Hezekiah prophesied to all those kings. So that's rather significant. We really don't have another prophet who speaks to the children of Israel for for such a length of time as we have with Isaiah. Now, this is a quote from the sages, from the rabbinic literature. And I thought it was very interesting, and I have to say it was one of those quotes that really kind of propelled me on this whole study of Hezekiah. And it says, "The Holy One wished to appoint Hezekiah as the Messiah, and Sennacherib, or Sanherib, as Gog and Magog." So it's very clear the sages identified Hezekiah with the Messiah, and they identified Sennacherib as the sort of anti-Messiah, or we might call Antichrist, sometimes false Messiah, however you want to look at it. But the key, really, in the life of Hezekiah was the restoration and the rebuilding of the temple. And it was a time of great restoration in the period of the kings of Judah in particular, and a time that the people themselves repented, and this sort of cleansing that went on, and this reconstruction really of the whole faith, and also the defeat of the enemy. And we'll see that. Certainly Yeshua, the Messiah's return, his second return, will be probably at a Sukkot period, and that will be the time of the great destruction of the enemy. And the sages typically associated the destruction of Gog and Magog at the time of Sukkot, or in the month of Tishrei, which is the 7th month. Now here, this is a look at some of the possible meanings of the name of Hezekiah. So Hezekiahu is his Hebrew name, comes from the word Hazak, which means strength, and then Yah, you can hear, which is the name for God. So Hezekiahu. And we could define it as God is strength, or the strong one of Yah. Strength comes from God, one who is strengthened by God, or the strength, just simply the strength of God. So all these are possibilities, but the key here, again, is the association of this word chazak, or strength, in speaking of Hezekiahu or Hezekiah. So that's kind of key. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting, too, that what the Talmudists, those that wrote the Talmud, said, this is their quote, Hezekiah was one who made a strong alliance between Israel and God. So can you see the picture of this one who would be a mediator between God and the people, which of course Yeshua accomplished in his life. He came as the mediator between the two. And so that is something that the ancients saw as well in the life of Hezekiah. So again, there just seems to be a lot of interesting connections between his life and between the life of Yeshua the Messiah. Now, another area that's quite important, and we will get into this in more detail as we go through this series, but Hezekiah was largely responsible for expanding the Temple Mount and where the temple itself stood to what we call the 500 cubits by 500 cubits area. So after King Solomon, I hope you remember that the kingdom was divided into two. We had Rehoboam, who was the king of Judah, and Jeroboam, who was the king of the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, who had centered his religion and political center was in Samaria. And so the temple was constructed under Solomon, and of course the services and everything functioned in that context. And it went through various stages of being destroyed and rebuilt, if you will, all through from Rehoboam on to Hezekiah. But it was really Hezekiah who was kind of the most responsible for the establishment of this Temple Mount area that we call, again, the 500 cubits by 500 cubits. And this is really kind of critical. The temple is not just this sort of static thing. So it's built, that's it, we're done. It was developing, in a sense, over time, and by the time we get to King Herod, coming up to the period of Yeshua, about 20 BCE, he expands it to the greatest extent that it was ever expanded. And he implemented things too. So it wasn't just this sort of fixed, this fixed building in time that never changed and never grew and never developed. But Hezekiah, again, is one who's key in that. And so this is also significant in his particular life. Kind of going back to the archaeology, we find, if you've ever been down to the Gihon Spring and the excavations there, you'll see it's just an absolutely fascinating, amazing place to go and to see. And the Gihon was what supplied the main water supply for the city of Jerusalem. And so towers had been built there to protect that water supply from the enemy. And the water that came from the Gihon flowed down to the pool of Shiloah, or the pool of Siloam. And the Gihon was really referred to as the fountain of living water. And through all this, there were many, many construction projects that he underwent in the city of Jerusalem. And not only was he responsible for these construction projects, but he was a man of deep and abiding faith. He had committed his life in prayer to the spiritual needs of the nation. And his is really the story of the history and the prophecy and the redemption of the people, because he's a type and a shadow then of Yeshua the Messiah. And really his story is the story of the spiritual revival of a nation and the call to return and rededicate the nation and oneself back to God. And again, this is the reason that the sages identified him as the Messiah. So hopefully in this you can see that we've really returned to a similar place. And it is time to return. The nation is in great need of a spiritual return back to God the Father. And one came who brought that restoration, who led the people and who committed his way on behalf of the people. So we'll see that in Hezekiah. We see that in the Messiah. Now here's just some facts, if you will, about Hezekiah, just so it helps you understand a little bit more about him. And again, he was the king of Judah, so that's significant. And he came to the throne at the age of 25. And we'll be talking in later programs about the significance of his age and the time he came to the throne. He was again the son of Ahaz, that was his father, and sort of tucked away in the narratives you'll find that the name of his mother was Aviah, whose name actually means my father is God. That's kind of interesting. He ruled for 29 years total, and we think he became ruler, independent ruler, somewhere around 715 BCE. And probably before that time, he was a co-regent with his father, King Ahaz. And around 701 BCE, this is the fixed date in history when Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came to attack Judah. And he attacked various towns around Jerusalem, and his last bit was to take out Jerusalem. So part of what we'll talk about is that attack. It appears he died somewhere around 687 BCE at the age of 54. And the significance, too, of his life is coming into his time to rule was the fall of Samaria, which, again, we'll talk about. It was sometime, I believe, 721, 722, 723, somewhere in there is the fall of Samaria. And as I said, we'll talk about it in more detail, but this is a very significant event historically in the life of Israel. Of course, that's when the northern tribes were dispersed and scattered to the four corners of the world and never, in a sense, to be seen or heard from again, although they will rise up out of the ashes. Now, it's said that he had an illness and he was given an additional 15 years. So we have to try to put that 15 years in somewhere. Where did that happen? Where was the 15 extra years that he was given, and how did that play out? So all these things are connected historically to Hezekiah, and we'll talk about them again in more detail. Just to mention his wife, although it's just sort of a passing word, Hephzibah is the name of his wife. You can find that in 2 Kings 21:1. And this Hephzibah, of course, is the mother of Manasseh. Now, Manasseh is Hezekiah's son, and he is a really bad guy. But he was the son of Hephzibah and Hezekiah. And her name means, in whom is my delight. And it also signifies something about a hidden treasure. And to me, this again points to the significance of the bride of the Messiah, which is us, kind of this hidden treasure. We are Yeshua's hidden bride, if you will, hidden in the world. And really nothing is said about her in the entire narrative of Hezekiah other than just to this passing mention. So again, as Hezekiah has come to restore all things, so too he will come again, and his bride will be waiting. And in the meantime, she is hidden in the nations. And so we can kind of see a connection between the two. Now, I'd like to continue, and we're going to go into something, and maybe seems like a little bit too much detail for you, but I think it's important for you to understand that studying the Kings can be one of the most confusing things, and it's really hard to sort it all out. So I'm going to take a stab at it here. Now, we have two ways of dating the kings and how they came to the throne. The first one is called the non-accession year method. And this particular way of dating applied only to Judah. There are many, many dating problems between the corresponding reigns of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. And so these two methods kind of help us unravel this. So the non-accession year method. Now, what happens with this is the death of a king was actually counted twice. And that's because the portion of the year he died was counted to him, and the remainder of the year was counted to the next king. So you see the problem there. We're not just counting it for one king. We're taking it and dividing it in half and counting it to two kings. So now we got 2 years instead of one. So you can imagine if we carry this out, we're running into big problems. So again, this is the non-accession year method applied to Judah, where when a king died, wherever it was in the year, part of that year was counted to him, and the next part of the year was counted to the next king that was became king on the throne. So there's these two methods, and so the numbers and of how long they ruled and what age they came to the throne, etc., all become important, and in trying to unravel this sort of mess here. So the other one is called the accession year method. And in this one, this applied to Israel. And this was what we call the regnal year for the kings of Israel, which actually began in the spring. The regnal year for Judah began in the fall. But anyways, the accession year method they didn't count the portions of the reign for a king's reign. So the portion of the year before they counted applied to that particular king, and that was it. So you can see already how we can run into serious problems, and we don't have this information. It's pretty hard to sort out who was where what and how many years, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the basic framework for that. Now again, we look at this with Judah. The regnal year began in Tishrei, which is the 7th month, and in terms of Judah, the accession year method applied, so we have a double counting. And then back to Israel, that's the northern tribes. That regnal year began in Nisan, or that's the springtime, the 1st month, and the non-accession year method applied. So we don't have double counting, we have single counting. So that's important again in distinguishing between the two reigns. Now I just would like to recommend a book which is a bit on the academic side and could be a little mind-numbing with all the numbers, but I think it's important, and at least will help you kind of understand what's going on. So it's called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, and it's by a man named Edwin Teal. And it gives you a lot of information on the chronology and the synchronism between the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. And it will help you put together these chronologies in the context of historical events. And again, explains these accession years in a lot more detail than what I've given you. Now, the last king of Israel, of the northern tribes, is King Hoshea. And he begins to rule somewhere around 732 BCE. Now, while he's on the throne as the last king of Israel, King Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, is on the throne in Judah. So those two are kings at the same time. And we don't really see any contact between Hezekiah, which makes us believe that Hezekiah came later than this. Although, there's plenty of controversy to go around. But some of the controversy is caused by the problems in dating, and the other is caused by the co-regencies. But for our purposes, we'll just try to focus in on the dates that are important, and it would appear that Ahaz then was on the throne when the northern tribes were dispersed and Assyria attacked, and Samaria was actually destroyed, the capital of the northern tribes. Now, King Ahaz, we know, died somewhere around 715 BCE, and there was somewhat of an overlap with Hezekiah. And you can see the map up here. Samaria was ground zero for the northern tribes. That was the capital. And according to Teal, the fall of Samaria took place in 723 BCE, although there's debate about that. And I've seen both 721, 722. But for the sake of this teaching, we're just going to go with the 723 BCE. Again, the scriptures are silent on any contact between Hezekiah and Hoshea, who was the last king of Israel. So that's why we think that Hezekiah probably came later than Hoshea. Usually, as you're studying and looking historically, there is some contact between Judah and Israel. So it's kind of unusual that there isn't any. And so all through the records of the divided kingdom, we see a constant references between the ruler of Israel and the ruler of Judah. So that's kind of significant. Now we're going to just sort of, before we can kind of conclude this section, just sort of introduce Ahaz, who is Hezekiah's father, who is a really bad guy. And it's important to understand the nature of Ahaz and how amazing it is of what Hezekiah accomplished when you consider this guy was his father. Now his name, Ahaz, also has the same root, if you can hear it, Hazak, which means strength or strong. Really the strong one is how we might translate it. And again, he began to rule somewhere 735, 732 BCE. His whole deal was collaboration with Assyria to keep Assyria at bay, which when you try to keep your enemy at bay really doesn't work that well. He ends up in conflicts with all his neighbors because he's joined himself to Assyria. And under his rulership, he's really made Judah a vassal state to Assyria. And so to me, he's the counterfeit, the picture of the false Messiah. And again, he's a very bad guy. Now, during the course, there's a lot of history about him in the context of certainly the king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser. I'm just going to encourage you to read some of these histories because, again, it's going to help you understand where we are today. But just briefly, he continually, Ahaz does appeals to the king of Assyria for protection. And in the meantime, when he does that, he gets attacked from Edom, and he gets attacked from the Philistines, and he gets attacked from Pekah, who was the king of Israel up in the north. So they're coming at him from all sides, and so he reaches out to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, for help. And Tiglath-Pileser responds by capturing Damascus, which we'll talk about that in a later program, the significance of Damascus. He dies, Ahaz does, somewhere around 715 BCE. Hezekiah then becomes the sole ruler, sole regent of Judah. And at that time, Hezekiah then recaptures the Philistine lands that were in the Negev and begins to form alliances between Ashkelon and Egypt. And he has an anti-Assyrian policy. So we'll get into all this in more detail. I'm trying to just lay the groundwork here and help you understand the significance of the history of this particular period. And it is in this context then, of course, the prophet Isaiah speaks all that he speaks. So thanks for joining, and we'll pick this up next time, and we're talking about Hezekiah, who is one who is in the shadow of the Messiah. Shalom.